I promise you I'm not used to this microphone at all. Also saw a couple more out there. Wilson Scaling, appreciate you being here. Head of SCS, underneath Ronald Reagan, and appreciate your attendance along with everybody else's. What we're here for today is to look at what we feel the facts of this case are. Charlotte Spraggins, good to see you here today. She was chair of the Red River County Commission underneath the first go-around, and we'll discuss that after a while. But yeah, glad to see all of you here. Wonderful to be here. Didn't know what this was going to be to start with, but I'm just proud to see everybody here. We want everybody to know the facts, because if you don't know the facts, it's hard to really work on an issue or a subject. If y'all want to gather on up a little closer, I don't bite hard. What this started is, if we all go back in history, we remember that back in 1803, the United States bought the Louisiana Purchase from the French, and they bought it to the South Cut Bank. No one argues that. That was the buy. It was a great buy by the United States. The second was 1819, and the Treaty of 1819, the Treaty of Anonymity, Adams' Owners Treaty. It was between Spain and the United States. And again, they reestablished, reaffirmed that the South Cut Bank is or was the boundary, international boundary between the United States and Spain at the time. Then come, again, they didn't really describe the South Cut Bank, just reaffirmed it. Then in 1923, as time moved along and they struck oil in some of the areas west of here, it became a lot more important to describe the South Cut Bank. And so they went to the Supreme Court in 1923, and the Supreme Court described the South Cut Bank as a gradient boundary. Now, a gradient boundary is a surveyor's term. It's difficult to find. It's just a surveyor's issue. But it's pretty close to the vegetation line of any surveyor that you talk to. After the Supreme Court ruling in 1924 and 1925, Colonel Stiles and Colonel Kidder was commissioned by the Supreme Court of the United States to hold testimony and interview landowners and hold meetings in the public courthouses along the river in each county on both sides. And in Clay County, where we are, Colonel Stiles and Colonel Kidder, and I have a list of the farmers they interviewed at the time, and they also held a public meeting in Henrietta at the courthouse. And in 1924-25, it's actually 25 when they were here in Clay County, they found absolutely no evidence of an avulsion taking place. They found no one that would testify or say, yes, we've had an avulsion in Clay County. So at least prior to 1925, we felt comfortable that we had no avulsions. I also had the wonderful opportunity to visit with a man named Robert Helton, and we'll talk about him later. But he worked for Colonel Stiles and Colonel Kidder, and I have some of his memos here in the pickup that talks about erosion, accretion, and avulsion. Let's flip over a couple of pages. Then we'll come back to the page eventually. That one. To understand the doctrines of the river, the first thing we've got to do is understand what erosion and accretion and avulsion is. Erosion and accretion, when we have erosion and accretion, the boundary follows the gradient boundary. It follows the river. Erosion and accretion, the erosion is simply the eroding away of one bank. The accretion is the building up of the other bank. Very textbook, slow movement for a textbook situation. An avulsion, on the opposite hand, the boundary stays fixed when you have an avulsion. As you showed here was an old channel of a river, and it cut across, but it left this land in between totally inundated with waters. So if there was a house there, barn there, pens there, trees there, whatever, they were there before and they were there after, and water didn't cover them. Water never covered those items. So they said you have inundated lands. Now granted, both of these are textbook events. The avulsion and the erosion and accretion. We all know that they're not all perfect, they're not all textbook. You have some in between, different ones. So we're going to go back now to the James versus Langford lawsuit.
Thanks.
In the 1970s, the Oklahoma landowner, Buck James, sued the Langfords, the Texas landowners, for this land back here behind us. The land that extends from where we see the wheat field bank here, where we're standing, out to the Oklahoma bank. Now, number one, it was accreted land. So the land had been, with erosion and accretion, the boundary was supposed to follow the river out. So the Langfords claimed that it was accreted land. James claimed that it was an avulsion that had occurred in 1908, 17 years prior to Stiles and Kidder, but Stiles and Kidder found no evidence of it. But anyhow, the claim was that in 1908, the river was running here, it rose, and when it went back down several days later, it was way out. Ever how far out they don't know, but it was a long ways out there. The judge concluded that it was an avulsion. We believe he was wrong. And again, when you go back to Robert Helton's paperwork, he claims, and since he worked with Stiles and Kidder, that speed is not the issue. In Oklahoma, for an avulsion to be an avulsion, it just says some rapid and sudden change in the channel. So this was appealed to the Supreme Court. They didn't hear it. But under Oklahoma doctrine, all it has to be is a sudden and rapid change. Now, under Texas doctrine and federal doctrine, there has to be uninundated lands between the old channel and the new channel. Well, it was pretty well testified that everything was wiped clean. All the sandbars was wiped clean. So under Texas or federal doctrine, that would have been erosion and accretion. Under Oklahoma doctrine, with a stretch, I can see where you could get possibly to an avulsion. So on mine, our suit, when Carrington sued us, and again, the United States was always listed as a party to these. They were always a part of it. They were always in the lawsuits. They were in the courthouse every time we were, on Langford's and on ours. On Carrington versus Henderson, it's a slightly different issue. Even though I think it was a bad ruling here, I think it was a worse ruling on us. Because on us, they sued again the Langford, but they used Henderson. The Langfords were here, Henderson next, and then the Dunns. Our land was all patented land from the state of Texas. In 1863, they patented this land to us. So we have a deed to it. As a matter of fact, Farmers Home Administration, a government agency, loaned me the money to buy mine that the federal government's wound up with, but I still had to pay them. But in the deal, the river in 1863 was approximately where it is today. It's maybe a couple of hundred yards further north, but it's very similar to where it was in 1863. But between 1863 and 1920, a period of 60 years, the river worked its way southward to where the judge drew the line at. But it took 40 more years to erode its way back out to where it is today. So it's 60 years coming in, 40 years going back out. Now, as you know, if you're borrowing money from Farmers Home Administration, each of you knows what my financial position was at the time, and it was poor. I was extremely poor at the time. The Langfords on this side was already bankrupt. I was poor. The other two men was older gentlemen, and one of them fought it a little bit, and I fought it a little bit too with what few chips I had in my pocket. Again, I had a title policy on it for what that's worth. At the time, in 1984, 1985, the U.S. Attorney was John Green. Good guy. And he actually agreed with the Texas landowners in 1984. Matter of fact, BLM even sent me the paperwork for grazing leases and color of title applications. And they were working with me to try to get it back, but it never happened. Yeah, let's go to the next one. Okay, get to that one in just a second. So what it seems like BLM is looking at now is taking two bad court decisions, one terrible decision, one bad decision, and extending those lines east and west to the 98th meridian and the forks of the Red and North Fork and South Fork. That's above Vernon. Now, I worked in Austin quite a bit down there trying to get some help, and eventually, about the time my lawsuit was ended, Governor Richards set up the Red River Boundary Commission that Charlotte Spraggins was chair of, and they worked hard, but it's a difficult issue, and they kind of laid a little of the groundwork for us once President Bush, or Governor Bush at the time, set up the Red River Boundary Commission for us, in which Bill Abney out of Marshall, Texas was chair. I was on the commission along with 4 other people. And we worked very hard with Oklahoma to come up with an agreement that both us and Oklahoma could agree to. Now, remember, the Supreme Court has already set the boundary, the gradient boundary. It cannot be changed. We didn't change that. We didn't talk about the actual boundary, because the boundary is the gradient boundary as set out by the Supreme Court. We did not have the authority to go in there and change that. We had the authority, though, to persevere it or push forward with what the Supreme Court had said. And so that's what we worked on. Now, on our commission, what we really looked at and what we really felt like we accomplished was giving some law enforcement in these river bottoms. The reason being, and if we were right here, just below here, and let's say there was some illegal activity taking place, and Texas comes in and picks up the offenders, and they take them to Clay County. The first offense of the offenders, the first thing, oh no, we was in Oklahoma. And Clay County can't spend $100,000 to decide whether they is in Texas or Oklahoma. By the same token, if Oklahoma picked them up in here, takes them to Warrica, they use the defense, oh, we was in Texas when we did it. It wasn't that we didn't do it, it was in Texas. And therefore Jefferson County couldn't spend $100,000 to prove where they were or weren't. It's just not feasible for the counties to do that. So it become a no man's land or an open range land to where whatever went on, went on. And as bad as our situation was, we found that over east in the clay type soils, where avulsions are more typical, textbook, in a clay soil than they are in this sand. Sandy soils generally don't have typical avulsions. They're erosion and accretion. But in eastern Texas, you had blocks of land, blocks of Texas land that laid north of the Red River, that for Texas law enforcement to get to would have to travel miles, hour and a half, 2 hours to a bridge across and come back to see what was going on. So those become kind of, the terminology was islands of sin. By the same token, you had islands on the south of the river that belonged to Oklahoma, because there had been an avulsion, a true avulsion. And those again were islands of sin, whether you want to have dog fights, gambling, you know, whatever it was, they were islands of sin with no law enforcement. So under our commissions, we set up and said, okay, this is what we've got to take care of. So we'll reinforce the 23 Supreme Court decision, because we can't change that. It is the gradient boundary, and that's what it is. And it's really qualified when you read the reports of it about being the lowest qualified bank. Well, we went to the vegetation line to set a jurisdictional boundary. So the gradient boundary is a political boundary. The vegetation line is a jurisdictional boundary. And I know it's real hard to wrap your hands around if you're not here to see it. But even though the courts have decided that this is Oklahoma, as soon as this tree line starts, Texas has jurisdiction there because it lies north of the boundary. That way they can use photographs or whatever we need to use in courts of law to decide where the offenders really were. And most of your courts and juries can look at an area and read how well Mr. Abney had detailed the vegetation line, about its sparsity and all that. I think any jury can read the compact and then look at a picture and say he's definitely in Texas or he's not in Texas, or he's in Oklahoma or he's not in Oklahoma. I don't think there's any question about it when you read the compact. Rick Hardcastle, Representative Rick Hardcastle, really worked real hard with us, and Senator Estes to get that through the House and the Senate, or down in Austin. And Mr. Dewhurst had met with us while he was land commissioner. He had met with us in Dallas, where we signed all the paperwork for it. And Congressman Thornberry then carried it through the Senate, or through the House in Washington for us, and got it done there. Again, we talked about the political versus the jurisdictional. Remember, political is the gradient boundary, jurisdictional is the vegetation line. And you say, okay, what's the difference in them? If you pick up a gallon of milk and it says 1 gallon and slash 3.8 liters on it, no, it's not. It's 3.785. Very, very close. The gradient boundary and the vegetation line are always very close to each other. They can be a few feet apart, but they will always be extremely close. So, has anybody got any questions over jurisdictional versus political? Because that's pretty important. I'll get rid of the next one too. Probably not going to use these others. Thanks. Here is a picture. No, leave it like that. This is a picture of the Langford suit. And again, here's the wheat field bank, and here's kind of where we're standing. The river ran here in 1863 when the river was patented out. Supposedly at some point in time around 1908, it moved out and moved over to the Oklahoma bank. Again, they call it avulsion, we call it erosion and accretion. But the BLM, or the United States, owns from the medial line to the South Cut Bank. So this is where the U.S. or BLM has come into play, is that they own the south half of that. Now the Oklahoma landowners own the north half, because it was deeded to them when Oklahoma was deeded out. It was deeded to the Oklahoma landowners to the medial line of the cut banks. Now why there's only federal land from the forks, the north and the south, to the 98th meridian, which is just east of us here a little ways, is because it was a different Indian tribe, so it was deeded out differently. If you go west of this area or east of this area, it's deeded to the Oklahoma landowners all the way to the south bank. It's only in this 116-mile stretch where it was only deeded halfway across. I've often asked the question, was it intentional or accidental, and nobody can answer it naturally. There we go to the next one. Go to the next one. Now this is a picture of the second suit where we're back up this way. And here is my land. Here was the Langford's land. Here was the Henderson land next to me, and the Dunn land next to that. Now when Texas was patented out in 1863, the river ran in the red line. So it was way north and come around to the bridge about just a little ways out there. And over a period again of 60 years, it worked its way from the red down to the orange lines in 1920, or in the 20s. And then it worked its way back over another 40 or 50 years back to where it is today. But yet they still call that an avulsion in the courts. And we simply was not able to battle it like we were supposed to battle it. You know, they took advantage of a poor man. And if I had it to battle today, I'd do it totally different. But they're wanting to use these two court decisions to set the Texas-Oklahoma boundary on these high geologic bluffs, not the gradient boundary where it's supposed to be. And I don't dispute that in some areas there was an avulsion, and Stiles and Kidder found a couple of them back out west. And they did document those. And wherever those avulsions took place at, that's where the river is today. I mean, that's where the boundary is. But most of this river, especially in these sandy soils, these are sandy alluvial soils, and the river moves by erosion and accretion, back and forth. It very seldom will you have an avulsion, a true avulsion, in these sandy soils. Okay, one more? No, I think we've been through. That's it.
That's it, okay.
Blank.
All right. The Lieutenant Governor's stuff.
Yes, all that. I'd like to give a quick opportunity. This is not political. This is strictly a fact-finding deal. But I would like see if Mr. Estes would like to say one word or two words about his involvement in it, because we do appreciate what he did.
Got it.
Well, I was getting educated there. There's a lot about this stuff I didn't understand.
Nobody does until they're here.
I just have to say I'd like to thank everybody for coming out here, and I know there's a great interest in this, and I know that this problem, like many other problems, can be solved in a reasonable, sane, and peaceful way. We're very glad to have Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst coming here in just a minute. In fact, he may be here right now, and Land Commissioner Jerry Patterson. So, and I just have to say that from Governor Perry to Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst to Speaker Strauss and all the House members here, thank you for coming a long way. Some even came as far as Houston. And we will figure this out. And we're sorry for a lot of the problems you've had to go through, but we're Texans and we're going to stick together and we're going to figure it out. That's about all I got to say about that. Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you, Mr. Estes. And again, Mr. Hardcastle's not here, but I want to say thank you to him especially since he's retired.
If I might, ladies and gentlemen, how about giving a big warm welcome to the Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Texas, David Dewhurst.